Present us, O Lord, in all our doings, and with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Welcome, everyone. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This afternoon, I take great pleasure in introducing to you and through you 26 public service employees seated in the Speaker's Gallery. Maybe they could give us a wave. All right, there we go. Welcome. They are here today to take part in the parliamentary program for the public service. This program includes a tour of the legislature, briefings presented by various branches of the Legislative Assembly Service and Executive Council, an opportunity to sit in the Speaker's Gallery and observe question period and other House business, and briefings with members of both sides of the House and with Mr. Speaker. The participation of employees are from the following ministries: Immigration and Career Training, Health, Advanced Education, Environment, Provincial Auditor's Office, Executive Council, Government Relations, Finance, Public Service Commission, Social Services, Justice, and Highways and Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming these visitors to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for John Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister for the Public Service Commission on behalf of the official opposition, welcome these public servants to their Legislative Assembly, and to say thank you very much for all the work that you do the whole year through, and as well to congratulate them in their diligence and their commitment to public service, to be here at the legislature to see how the political side of things works. It takes an extra measure of commitment, I'd imagine, but certainly it speaks well to the motivations and the talents here in the gallery today, Mr. Speaker. So I'd again join with the Minister on behalf of the official opposition, welcoming these public servants to their Legislative Assembly.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask leave for an extended introduction.
Leader of the Opposition has asked leave for extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to welcome folks in the gallery opposite are here from SEIU West. Some great representatives of the folks who work throughout our province in many different fields: bus drivers, janitors, teachers' aides, clerical staff, addictions counselors, group home workers, licensed practical nurses, special care aides, daycare workers, ambulance personnel, and we're probably missing a few. And these are folks who, through their advocacy, are making it very clear that it's essential that we put care first and that Purple works. And I want to introduce the individuals that are here with us today. We have Sheila Borick from Swift Current. We have Letta Raquel Lee from Saskatoon, Chelsea Loris from Saskatoon, a good friend, Danelle Pickering from Saskatoon, and I like to say, I've said it before, not all heroes wear capes, but some of them are capes, and it's a great honor to see the President of SEIU West, Barb Cape, here with us today. I ask all the members to join me in welcoming them to their legislature.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the member opposite in welcoming these people to their legislature. We're proud in our province of having a democratic process where people can feel free to come forward, raise issues, and take a position. And SEIU West has taken strong positions on things and been strong advocates for their member, and for that they are to be commended and thanked. I read the books that have been written by Andy Stern, the former president of SEIU, who talks about progressive relationships between organized labor and management, and think that there's some very good thoughts for both sides on those things, and we look forward to continuing our work with them and hope to have some resolutions. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Didn't even look over.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to present a petition today for the provincial government to develop and implement a suicide prevention strategy. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners point out on this very important issue that the Saskatchewan Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act was introduced in 2018 but has not been passed because it has not received the support from the Sask Party government. The petitioners point out that suicide remains the second leading cause of death for young people from age 15 to 34 in Canada, that suicide rates for First Nations people in Saskatchewan are 4 times higher than that of non-First Nations people, that in 2018, 1 in 3 suicides were among children in care. They also draw our attention to the fact that there were nearly 2,100 people who died by suicide here in Saskatchewan between 2005 and 2018. Mr. Speaker, that's larger than many towns here in Saskatchewan. They point out that there was a 49% increase in annual suicides in our province since 2005, and that they would argue amounts to a crisis, and we would agree on this side of the House. A suicide prevention strategy in other parts of the country, like Quebec, for example, and other parts of the world these strategies have done a really good job of assessing the situation, filling in the gaps, making sure decisions on resources are well spent, Mr. Speaker. This is an absolutely imperative petition and an imperative bill that this government pass. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the provincial government to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to address suicide in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, this petition today is signed by citizens of Eston and Outlook. I so present.
And as a member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Maymont. I do so present.
As the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition on behalf of Northern Saskatchewan residents that seniors in the North have worked hard to help build their province. There is a definite need for a new long-term care facility in Creighton and surrounding area. Saskatchewan families are being forced to separate, and this causes many hardships, including complex income tax filings with Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan treat Northern Saskatchewan senior citizens with respect and dignity and immediately invest in a new long-term care facility for Creighton and surrounding area. It is signed by many good people of Denair Beach. I so present.
And as a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present a petition on behalf of concerned residents, communities, businesses from across Saskatchewan as it relates to the imposition of the PST onto things like construction labor, the hike of the PST onto an expansion onto everything from children's clothes through to restaurant meals and construction labor. Of course, this has hit households hard. It's also hurt our economy. The average household is now paying $800 more per year in PST than what they were paying just a few years ago, and that's each and every year, $800 more. And quite simply, it's the epitome of a job-killing tax. We look at the sad result, the consequences of this change. We see that permits are down all across Saskatchewan, so many projects that have been shelved, and thousands of hardworking tradespeople that have lost their jobs, lost their employment, so many that have been pushed outside Saskatchewan in the pursuit of employment. Certainly a hardship and a loss for them and their families, but a real loss for us as a province. The prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents of Regina. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for a $15 minimum wage here in Saskatchewan. The undersigned residents of this province want to bring to our attention the following, that Saskatchewan now has the lowest minimum wage in Canada. But a minimum wage should not be a poverty wage, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people working full-time at minimum wage jobs are living in poverty, and that a $15 minimum wage will improve health and well-being and lift Saskatchewan workers out of that poverty. We know that a $15 minimum wage will benefit local businesses and support local economies by putting money into workers' pockets to spend in their own communities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to adopt a plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour for all workers in Saskatchewan. I do so present, thank you, Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from the City of Regina. I do so present.
Here, here. Recognize a member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party government to fix the crisis in our classrooms. Those who have signed this petition wish to draw our attention to some points. First, that the Sask Party government's cuts mean falling per-student funding and fewer supports for students who need extra help. That the Sask Party government's cuts leave educators without the resources that they need to support student learning, and that the Sask Party government is ignoring overcrowding in our classrooms by refusing to track and report on classroom sizes. In addition, Mr. Speaker, that the Sask Party government's lack of funding for school infrastructure has led to crumbling and overcrowded schools, and that the Sask Party government's failure to invest in our classrooms is having serious consequences today, and that it will continue to unless it's fixed into the future. Mr. Speaker, I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately fix the crisis in our classrooms by properly funding the most important investment that we can make in our children. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition reside in Craik, in Marquess, and in Regina. I do so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to present a petition in support of in-house security services in Saskatchewan healthcare facilities. These residents wish to bring to our attention that the Government of Saskatchewan Security Services review in the SHA appears to be driven by a desire to contract out and cut costs rather than to improve safety in healthcare. That while increased violence and threatening behaviour in healthcare facilities is a concern, the SHA survey contains a number of leading questions. The consultant chosen to lead the review has demonstrated history of bias towards privatizing affecting workers' rights in public health care, that frontline workers have the solutions to address increased violence and safety concerns in public health care, more in-house staff, proper equipment and training, and improved incident reporting and follow-up, and that safe, quality health care means having adequately staffed, properly trained and equipped in-house security team, not cutting jobs and contracting out to the lowest bidder. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to commit to maintaining quality, publicly funded, publicly delivered, and publicly administered security services. This petition is signed by individuals from Saskatoon, Lambton, and Regina. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's with a heavy heart that I join people across the world on International Transgender Day of Remembrance. Today is an opportunity to memorialize those who were killed due to anti-transgender hatred or prejudice. This important day of recognition allows us to remember the many people who have been victims of these homicides, raising public awareness of the hate crimes, and provide a safe space for public mourning. While there is still a shocking number of homicides reported each year, the numbers only reflect the murders of transgendered people that can be documented and often don't capture the crimes committed worldwide, which are often unreported or misreported. Mr. Speaker, this kind of hatred is unacceptable. It's only through compassion and acceptance that we can begin to help transgender people feel safe in their communities. Mr. Speaker, we at the Saskatchewan NDP caucus have called for changes to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code in order to provide better protection for all Saskatchewan residents and continue to call on this government to do better in providing supports and services for transgender individuals needing medical care in the province. I call on all members of this Assembly to give honour to the hundreds of transgender people who have lost their lives because of transphobia and homophobia. I hope that we can strive towards creating a world where this kind of violence does not exist anymore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many great Canadian authors come from Saskatchewan, as we saw just recently in our Saskatchewan Book Awards. On October 21, 2019, one of the most divisive Canadian federal elections was held, and for many Canadians, elections and comedy just don't mix. But, Mr. Speaker, this is not the case for Lloydminster-born Elena Fenrick. Elena is an author who recently flew back home from Newfoundland for a book signing in Saskatchewan. Her first book, A Bewildering Week, is a political comedy set in rural Saskatchewan, Toronto and Newfoundland the week after the 2015 federal election. The book follows Barlow Warner, the disgraced leader of a health-focused political party. The story moves between St. John's, Toronto, and rural Saskatchewan and features a vibrant cast of characters who include Barlow's parents, grandmother, siblings, and best friend. Without giving away too much, the health party fails due to a scandal, with the plot picking up the following week. I highly encourage all members to read it. Mr. Speaker, Elena was born and raised in Lloydminster and grew up next door to me. Although Elena has moved to Newfoundland, we're happy to have her back anytime, and we encourage her to keep writing about Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I now invite all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Elena on her new political comedy.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, November 18th, I had the pleasure of attending the Saskatchewan School Boards Association banquet, where I was pleased to visit with members of the Prince Albert Catholic School Board, the Saskatchewan River School Board, along with school board members from across our province. Mr. Speaker, it turned out to be an exciting evening as Prince Albert and Area's public school board, the Saskatchewan River School Board, was announced as the recipient of the Premier's Board of Education Award for Innovation and Excellence in Education in recognition of their Students for Change program. This award, developed in 1999, recognizes education innovations and improvement which are focused on student achievement and which have been directed by boards of education. Along with the board members, 4 students were on hand to accept the award. 2 past and 2 present student representatives who sit at the school board meetings, Jerica Gooding, Kelly Lamb, Sam Miller, and Elizabeth Pala, who happens to be my niece, and I'm very proud of her accomplishments. I wish to acknowledge the dedication and hard work of the Director of Education, Robert Bradfold, Board Chair Barry Halleck, and board members Jamie Smith-Windsor, Darlene Roden, Michelle Vickers, John McIver, Grant Gustafson, Bill Garreau, Bill Yeeman, and Arnie Lindbergh. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me in congratulating the Saskatchewan River School Board on receiving this well-deserved recognition. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a board member of the Meewasin Valley Authority, I want to congratulate the organization on its 40th anniversary. During my time as a board member, I've had the opportunity to really understand the significance and expertise of this organization. Mr. Speaker, Meewasin is unique and a shining example of our province's ability to conserve, develop, and educate all people on our natural and cultural environment. More than just an urban park, Meewasin works with the Ministries of Agriculture, Environment, and Parks to steward and rehabilitate the lands of the Meewasin Valley. Mr. Speaker, Meewasin consists of 67 square kilometres of both urban and rural land, with over 1.2 million visits to the valley each year. Meewasin has set both long and short-term strategic goals, which align perfectly with our provincial growth plan to 2030. Mr. Speaker, the Meewasin Valley Authority has announced its support for our Prairie Resilience Climate Action Strategy, which will reduce carbon emissions by up to 12 million tonnes by 2030. We are proud to partner with Meewasin and continue to support its ongoing plans. Mr. Speaker, I now invite all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating the Meewasin Valley Authority on their 40th anniversary and all the best in the next 40 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the Saskatchewan Association of Recreation Professionals. The association was founded with only 17 members, but has grown to over 200 today. Mr. Speaker, association members work in many fields across the province, including tourism, education, community recreation, and health and wellness, to name a few. These professionals contribute to the mental and physical well-being of Saskatchewan families and create a vibrant quality of life for all people. I had the pleasure of bringing greetings on behalf of the government to their AGM luncheon, as well as their evening awards reception. As a recreation professional, it was my honour to present the Builders Award to Murray Heidelbaugh, my former program head at Sask Polytechnic. He, along with 16 other members, had a grand vision for the recreation profession in our province and followed through with strategic action to turn that vision into a reality. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate all the recreation professionals who are nominated for awards for their hard work and dedication. Thank you to the Association's Executive Director, TJ Beamans, and his team for the many hours they spent planning the events. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members of this Assembly join me in congratulating the Saskatchewan Association of Recreation Professionals on their 50th anniversary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Regina Gardner Park.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. It's with a heavy heart that I rise to inform the House of passing of larger-than-life Saskatchewan sporting legend Kelly Bowers earlier this year. Kelly started teaching in 1973, which coincided with a coaching, reffing, and administrative career that lasted nearly 50 years in the sports of football, basketball, wrestling, and track, and frankly, anything else that needed doing. He was a mainstay at his alma mater, Bedford Road Collegiate. While there, he was deeply involved in the famous Brit tournament, and no one will forget his improbable, triumphant return to Bedford Road to coach its football team to a provincial championship in 1998. Prior to that, he coached the Hilltops for 12 years, winning the national championships in 91 and 96. He was most recently involved with Kinsman Minor Football and did on-air broadcasts with the Huskies. He was Kinsman Sportsman of the Year in 2001, received the SHSAA Award of Merit in 2007, and was inducted to the Saskatoon Sports Hall of Fame in 2011 as a builder. His old friend Dave Hardy described him as someone I respected so much because he always put others ahead of himself. It was never about him. Others talked about his boundless energy, his total commitment, and he was passionate about everything. Current Hilltops coach Tom Sargent said, "He was a gift to all of us. Saskatoon will never be the same without him." Mr. Speaker, anyone who knew Kelly can never forget his famous, booming, gravelly voice. The thousands of lives he made better in our province will also not soon be forgotten. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 8th, on behalf of the government, I had the pleasure of joining with the City of Prince Albert to celebrate the completion of the new River Street Water Reservoir project. This project will strengthen and support community growth by increasing drinking water storage and capacity, as well as increasing availability of safe drinking water for our city. I'm very proud of this project, to have safe, reliable drinking water for the people of Prince Albert now and for the future. Our government is proud to have invested $3 million to this project. Mr. Speaker, the milestone marked on November 8th is just one of many important infrastructure projects our government has helped support. Since 2007, our government has invested over $35 million to the City of Prince Albert's infrastructure. Projects like over $900,000 in pavement upgrades, nearly $700,000 to road utility reconstruction, over $400,000 to the West Hill paving project, nearly $20 million to the Aquatic and Arena Centre project. That's just to name a few, Mr. Speaker. Our government is proud to have invested in so many infrastructure projects in the great city of Prince Albert, and we will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we released a Saskatchewan Health Authority memo that detailed efforts to prevent doctors and other frontline workers from advocating on behalf of their patients. The Minister of Health came out and said that the memo was poorly worded, and then he got the SHA to claim that it was about privacy. Well, Mr. Speaker, these arguments are absolute nonsense. The intent and purpose of that memo were as clear as day, and everyone in this House knows how FOI works, that private and personal information can't be disclosed and will be redacted. Mr. Speaker, we also know that hallway medicine under the Sask Party has become the norm. We know that our emergency rooms are under great stress, that frontline workers are extremely concerned, yet they're being told to stay silent and to not advocate for the resources they need to make things better. So my question for the Premier, will he today make it clear that honesty about what's really happening in healthcare is more important than covering his own political hide, or will he continue to put politics before people?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, that's just wrong on so many levels. Mr. Speaker, when the member introduced the memo in the House yesterday, neither the Premier nor I had seen it before. We did not direct that memo. Mr. Speaker, I do believe it was poorly worded. It could have been worded much more clearly, but the SHA did a statement to the media which clarified that, Mr. Speaker. In part, it says the SHA does not have a policy, nor was there ever any intent to restrict staff or physicians from exercising their right to free speech. We recognize additional clarity is required. We will be working in the following days to ensure staff and physicians are clear on the intent of this memo. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition tried to portray this as somehow that doctors were fearing about speaking up or advocating for patients, that somehow they'd be punished. Mr. Speaker, that's ridiculous. I meet with doctors all the time. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite, who went to great pains when he was elected to talk about how he was going to do things differently, completely neglected to mention before he was elected, he's one of the doctors I met with, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Frontline health and education workers are sacrificing their own health and well-being for our patients, students, the most vulnerable. They're putting their own lives on the line to do that work, and yet they're told over and over again that they can't speak up when they see problems. They're afraid because they are afraid there will be retribution for the stories that they bring forward, for the true stories of what's actually going on in those departments. Mr. Speaker, one nurse told us how Regina emergency rooms are recycling nurses faster than Sarcan does bottles and cans. This government is letting people down, letting down the workers on the front line and letting down the health of Saskatchewan people. Does the Premier believe that the people of Saskatchewan deserve a government that's willing to fix hallway medicine, or is he happy with one that simply sweeps it under the rug and does everything they can to hide the information from the public?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, this government has taken many steps to ensure that people aren't muzzled, that people have an opportunity to step forward and say where they're concerned about something. Just as an example, Mr. Speaker, just a few years ago, a program called Stop the Line was an initiative so that patients, staff, physicians can identify and fix any potentially harmful situations, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, staff have an opportunity to use the Ombudsman's office. Mr. Speaker, there's any number of avenues through their union process they can. Mr. Speaker, this is just, it's completely wrong. I mentioned about meeting with the Leader of the Opposition before he was elected in government. I met with him and a colleague of his, Dr. Stuart Skinner, I believe his name is, who were advocating on behalf for their HIV patients. Mr. Speaker, as a result of that and many other conversations and many other policy decisions, we became, I believe, the first province in the country to universally cover HIV medication. Mr. Speaker, was that member scared? Was he scared for his job at the time, Mr. Speaker? I don't think so.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely true. I've spoken up as an advocate on health issues over and over again, and I won't stop today. It's also absolutely true that my colleagues at that time and my colleagues today and so many other frontline workers experience the fear of speaking out. They're worried that funds will be cut from their programs. They're worried that they will lose their jobs. And you know what? It seems like there's someone who has fear of speaking out today. Mr. Speaker, it seems there's someone else who's afraid to speak out today. Maybe he got a hush memo from the folks who are really running the show on that side. So my question for the Premier, how does he feel about the fact that his government has a reputation for intimidating frontline workers into silence?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Premier very well, and I think of any fears he may have, the Leader of the Opposition is not one of them. Mr. Speaker, it's ridiculous what he's saying, that somehow people are punished and lose. What was it? I think that their department would be caught funding? Where? Yeah. Where was that? Show us where that would have happened, Mr. Speaker. It's nonsense. It's fear-mongering. It's gotcha politics, which, Mr. Speaker, is kind of fascinating, coming from the Leader of the Opposition who wrote a book called A Healthy Society. And on page 35 of his book, Mr. Speaker, I read parts of that book in a weaker moment. Mr. Speaker, on page 35, this is what it says. He's talking about social determinants of health. He says, it allows us to move beyond the gotcha politics of personality and the goldfish memory of the news cycle to a long-term strategy for real development. Mr. Speaker, it's funny how quickly he dropped that pretense and moved to gotcha politics.
Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
That was a real gotcha moment there. You really
Mr. Speaker, as a family physician, I worked alongside patients who are sick and struggling. And over again, I would work with my colleagues, with patients, with community organizations, and we would knock on the doors of this government. And every time we knocked, the answer we would get was no. And that's why it's so important that we change who's answering the doors.
Order. Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Better one. Mr. Speaker, the hush memo that made it very clear that this is exactly what goes on in this government, refers to, and I quote, instances of challenging that have not met communication standards. Aside from instances of challenging being a pretty bizarre turn of phrase, it points very clearly to what this government wants to avoid. They want to avoid anyone making waves, speaking out, telling the truth about what's really happening in healthcare. And the memo goes on to instruct public servants not to write down important details that may clash with, and I again quote, the SHA corporate identity standards. The Premier has to choose. He has to choose to get on his feet and defend his own government, and he has to choose what's more important to him and his government, avoiding challenges to the corporate identity standards or the health and well-being of Saskatchewan people.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I've said that the SHA did a statement yesterday, and they're going to clarify the policy and intent of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. The intent is definitely not to muzzle anyone, to allow people the right for free speech. Mr. Speaker, but I come back to what the member keeps insinuating. He talks about, what was it he said, Mr. Speaker, that I knocked on doors of government and the answer was always no? Mr. Speaker, I just explained that when I first became health minister, I met with that member before he was a member of the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and Dr. Stuart Skinner. We had a great conversation, Mr. Speaker, on a number of issues, including they were advocating for HIV patients, Mr. Speaker. That eventually led to universality of coverage for all HIV patients in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that answer wasn't no, that answer was yes.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It sounds like that minister needs to check in with frontline workers. Mr. Speaker, The Health Minister just received 1,750 postcards from Saskatchewan people who are concerned with short staffing in healthcare, and that doesn't include the 1,600 that were signed online. Workers who provide frontline healthcare in Saskatchewan are facing a crisis. They are expected to work with less staff than they need to provide safe care. The needs of their patients, residents, and clients have grown in acuity, while we hear that shifts are routinely left unfilled and positions vacant, taking a toll on their physical and mental health. Frontline care workers have some of the highest rates of workplace injury and burnout in Saskatchewan. Hear, hear. What is this minister's plan to fix this and ensure there are enough staff in our healthcare facilities?
Hear, hear. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, since we've been given the privilege of forming government, we've increased resources tremendously, 60%, I believe, overall in healthcare spending since 2007, Mr. Speaker. Frontline services take up the bulk of that, Mr. Speaker. Staffing takes up the bulk of that. So, Mr. Speaker, we've added more resources. We've had success in many areas. Most notably, 900 more doctors, 3,800 more nurses, Mr. Speaker. Other frontline care workers, Mr. Speaker, continuing care assistants, an 11.7% increase, diagnostic medical sonographers, 42.1%, LPNs 32%, the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. But we also do have areas where recruitment's been difficult. Mr. Speaker, we make every effort to continue with that. Mr. Speaker, the SHA is attempting to recruit. In some cases, we've worked with advanced education to increase training seats for especially hard-to-recruit positions, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work and support the SHA in their efforts.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, those numbers are cold comfort for the frontline staff who are here today, who are working in those working conditions every day. The emergency departments in Saskatoon and Regina continue to face overcapacity challenges. Last week, the Minister of Health proposed to alleviate the pressure by repatriating patients closer to home, sending them back to facilities in their home communities. Well, we've heard from frontline care providers as well as patients and families that many of these patients have chosen to come to Saskatoon or Regina hospitals because Sask Party cuts have made it harder to get the care they need in their communities. And they're reluctant to be repatriated for those same reasons. What investments does this minister plan to make to address the problem in the short term and to ensure appropriate staffing levels in the long term?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the officials at the SHA are working diligently to improve the conditions right now with emergency room wait times. Mr. Speaker, we're extremely concerned about what's happening there. One of the steps they're taking is the repatriation back to home community hospitals that I mentioned and the member opposite just mentioned. Mr. Speaker, I have no idea what she's referring to when she says that they've chosen to not go there because of cuts. Mr. Speaker, there have not been cuts to health care. There's been a 60% increase in health care spending. Right. Mr. Speaker, we continue to staff regional and community hospitals around the province, Mr. Speaker, which is in sharp contrast to the 52 hospitals closed when the members opposite were in government.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apparently the minister also needs to check in with patients as well, rather than just referring back to his talking points. Saskatchewan's long-term care facilities continue to experience unsafe staffing levels, and residents and their families have repeatedly called for improved staffing levels. We know the Ministry of Health was conducting a review of its program guidelines for special care homes to, quote, ensure a high quality of care. That was supposed to be completed on June 30th. However, we have yet to see those guidelines, and this government twice voted down legislation to bring back minimum care standards in long-term care. Where are those guidelines, and will they include proper minimum staffing levels?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, this government, is, through the SHA and the Ministry of Health, has worked hard to recruit all positions in healthcare, Mr. Speaker. As I said, doctors, nurses, other medical professionals, and other frontline care workers, Mr. Speaker. I read with interest the SEIU West media release this morning, Mr. Speaker, that refers to the hard-to-recruit list of jobs. Mr. Speaker, and it goes on to talk about that what attracts people to a job is financial compensation they receive. Mr. Speaker, I'm told by officials that right now that healthcare providers outside of sort of the nurses and doctors, that sort of thing, Mr. Speaker, right now are at 98% of the Western Canadian average, Mr. Speaker. Two of the provider unions have ratified their agreement, Mr. Speaker. I think we need to allow the collective bargaining process to proceed, Mr. Speaker, and hopefully that will be rectified soon.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I will take the word of frontline staff before taking the word of that minister any day of the week.
Let's keep our comments from away from the personal side of things. Remember, everyone is honourable in this House. I recognize the member for Fairview.
Hard to remember.
Mr. Speaker, throughout this session, we've raised the overcapacity issues faced by emergency departments in Saskatchewan hospitals. But across the province, there hasn't been an increase in staffing to keep up with the increase in demand. Why won't the minister ensure that Saskatchewan hospitals receive the frontline staff resources they need?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the issue with the emergency room wait times and the hallway medicine is a very serious condition, and the member is absolutely right to bring those up. Mr. Speaker, it needs to be clarified that we've made it completely clear to SHA officials that financial resources are not to get in the way of rectifying this problem, Mr. Speaker. They realize that they have all resources at their disposal. We talked about the repatriation of patients to home communities, Mr. Speaker. Certainly that's part of the issue. Right. Part of the issue is capital funding to expand the number of medicine beds available so that the system doesn't backlog, Mr. Speaker. We're considering any and all avenues, Mr. Speaker. I had a conversation this morning with both my Deputy Minister, the Minister of Rural and Remote Health, and officials from the SA to express how important we think this is and how urgent the situation is, Mr. Speaker. We need to let those officials do their good work.
There's a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, in committee this fall, social services officials told us they have been hearing the same concerns about the new Saskatchewan Income Support Program as we are. That direct payments are a challenge for many clients. That the cost of utilities far exceeds what is now rolled into the shelter allowance. That the requirement to have a bank account isn't always realistic, and that the letter of guarantee poses challenges for clients. This is a long list of issues for a brand new program, yet the minister seems unwilling to go back to the drawing board and revise this program. Why not?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, the whole program of our new Saskatchewan Income Support Program is to help people that are coming on social assistance be able to bridge back to independence. Mr. Speaker, as far as the Landlords Association, I've met with them several times to be able to hear their concerns, Mr. Speaker, but we also want to get rid of the stigma attached to a letter of guarantee. When a person walks into a potential rental situation and they have that letter of guarantee, Mr. Speaker, that instantly tells everybody that they're on social assistance. Mr. Speaker, we want to be able to make sure that our clients that are on social assistance for a temporary period of time are treated with a special, with a manner that everybody else is renting that place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There's a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, last week the minister said he hadn't heard what issues the anti-poverty advocates were sounding the alarm about. Well, Mr. Speaker, there are many of the same issues on the front that the frontline workers have been raising since this program started. This program doesn't cover actual costs of utilities and doesn't reflect the variance in how much people across the province in inadequate housing can be forced to pay for heating costs. They're concerned that these new benefits that leave people short will increase domestic violence, acute health care, and homelessness. Is the minister comfortable with these risks on his watch? And if not, what is his plan to deal with them?
As the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As far as part of that question dealing with domestic violence, if anybody's coming into social services, they are immediately stepped onto a different track if they are experiencing any domestic or physical or sexual violence, Mr. Speaker. We immediately put them in contact with anybody that they need within the healthcare system or within social services. Mr. Speaker, as far as the utilities and the rent not being extra, Mr. Speaker, they're already included in the rate that they're getting. And I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, on top of that, what we've also introduced for the first time ever, Mr. Speaker, under Saskatchewan income support are earning exemptions. That individual can go out and earn up to $500 so they can help that transition them back to independence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
These aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. These are the words of organizations on the front lines who say this new program isn't working. And instead of trying to explain away issues, why doesn't the minister get down to work and fix them? The consequences of this failure are serious, Mr. Speaker. Saskatoon Housing Initiatives Partnership, the Lighthouse, Regina Anti-Poverty, the YWCA, and EGAS are all saying if we don't change course, many people will end up on the streets. Winter is coming, Mr. Speaker, and this is a risk that the minister shouldn't be willing to take. Again, to the minister, will he listen to the people on the front lines and make changes to this program before it's too late?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. And we did create a program that works for all of our clients, Mr. Speaker. The program, or the specific community-based organizations that has been identified by the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, are organizations that are dealing with some very difficult, challenging. And it bothers me continuously, Mr. Speaker, that they stereotype all social services clients that have mental health and addictions problems, because that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. The case is, Mr. Speaker, we have some people, we have some single moms that are transitioning, we have some people that are new Canadians that are also on this program, Mr. Speaker. The people that do have mental health and addictions is actually a very small percentage of the people that we're dealing with within social services, Mr. Speaker, but we also want to make sure that they get the proper treatment that they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Yesterday, the minister stood on his feet and claimed that his government had provided $30 million to hire additional EAs. We all know, Mr. Speaker, that this was but a partial backfill of their 2017 cuts, and this funding is only a drop in the bucket in an ocean of needs. Teachers and EAs are doing all they can to minimize the impacts on our kids, but there's only so much that they can do with inadequate funding. Over the past 6 years, the number of children requiring intensive supports in our schools has gone up by 11%. Yet only 46 EAs were added across the province. With class sizes climbing, Mr. Speaker, and increasing complexities, how much longer do schools have to wait for adequate EA resources?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Sure. Mr. Speaker, I want to clarify a point that the member made. When the $30 million was added to the budget, Mr. Speaker, it was very clear that that was the equivalent of 400 EAs, Mr. Speaker. That money is provided to the school divisions, Mr. Speaker. There's no strings attached to that money. The school divisions can do what they like with that money, Mr. Speaker. But the commitment was made by the Premier, Mr. Speaker. That commitment was fulfilled, Mr. Speaker. Now, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we know, Mr. Speaker, that there's more complexity in our classrooms than ever before, Mr. Speaker. We know that complexity in class sizes are issues, Mr. Speaker. That's precisely why we've struck a committee, Mr. Speaker, to deal with this issue. Now, the member opposite will always say, stands up and says, well, and she said this, and the Leader of the Opposition has said, spending alone isn't going to solve the problem, Mr. Speaker, and we agree with that. We need to have a plan so that when new resources are made available in public education, that they can go to deal with the very real issues, Mr. Speaker. We've heard from the STF, Mr. Speaker, who have said there's no crisis in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. The SSBA has said that, Mr. Speaker. We agree, but we are going to put a process in place to deal with these very important challenges.
Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, we've also said that money alone is not enough, but we do need enough money, and I wish the minister would have heard that from so many board trustees at the SSBA this weekend. This is disheartening to see the level of stress and despair that teachers and EAs and parents face because of the lack of proper resources in the education system.
That's right. Increased
Violence in the classroom, increased mental health issues, more complexity that they have to deal with every single day. Mr. Speaker, 86% of EAs that responded to our survey confirmed that they have more students with additional needs than they had 3 years ago. 65% of EAs say that staff morale at their school has worsened, and 77% of EAs say that there are 5 or more children in their classrooms who require additional supports that they are not currently receiving. The Premier broke his promise to hire 400 additional EAs. When will the minister stop letting students down and step up with the EA supports that our students need?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I want to state categorically for the record that the Premier did not breach his promise, Mr. Speaker. $30 million was added into the formula, Mr. Speaker, which is the equivalent of 400 EAs, Mr. Speaker. Now,
Are you
if the member
suggesting
opposite,
we take over the school divisions?
Mr.
Are you
Speaker,
suggesting?
Mr. Speaker, if the member opposite
Are you
wants
suggesting
us
we
to
take
start,
over the school divisions?
Mr. Speaker, if
Or
the
is that
member
what you're
opposite
suggesting?
wants
We
us to
provided
start
the money.
directing money to school divisions, if she wants, Mr. Speaker, for us to take away the autonomy of school divisions in terms of the funding decisions that they need to make, she only has to stand up on her feet and say that, Mr. Speaker. And we're happy to talk about that, Mr. Speaker. But the fact of the matter is we've recognized the challenges in our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. It's precisely why we put our committee together, Mr. Speaker, to deal with these very real issues, Mr. Speaker. But to suggest that the Premier of this province broke his promise when that $30 million commitment was made, Mr. Speaker, is plain wrong, and that member owes an apology to the Premier of Saskatchewan and the members on this side of the House.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day, written question. Question number 19, asked by Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the government. Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 19 to 30.
Ordered questions 19 to 30.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 1, the Honourable Ms. Carr to move first reading of Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move the second reading of Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Statutes Municipal Amendment Act 2019. This bill, if passed, will amend the 3 acts that govern municipalities in Saskatchewan: the Cities Act, the Municipalities Act, and the Northern Municipalities Act 2010. The Cities Act governs cities. The Northern Municipalities Act 2010 governs all municipalities in the north, and the Municipalities Act governs rural municipalities, towns, villages, resort villages, and organized hamlets. Together, these 3 acts are extremely important in the province, as they set the bounds and establish the framework in which all municipalities operate, govern, and are governed. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is important to regularly review and amend the municipal legislation to ensure it continues to meet the needs of municipalities, the public, and the province. Over the last year and a half, our municipal sector stakeholders have had the chance to suggest and review many proposals, and the result of that work is before you today. While there are many minor changes and adjustments in this bill, I will speak to 4 of the main categories or areas of amendment, highlighting the more substantive amendments in these areas. The first of these is protection of reprisal, which protects municipal employees who report wrongdoings. Workplace harassment is a growing concern, and it is important to protect those who report it and other wrongdoing from further suffering as a consequence. While several avenues exist for municipal employees to report wrongdoing, a municipal employee is not specifically protected from reprisal from councillors or council members who are very much in a position of power but are not considered the actual employer. The provisions proposed in this bill will close the gap and complement existing legislation regarding the reporting of wrongdoing. The second broad category of amendments proposed are administrative efficiencies for municipalities. These changes aim to modernize, streamline, and reduce some of the administrative burden of running a municipality. An example of this is replacing the various references in the Act to mail, fax, and telephone with the words contact information, allowing a person to indicate the most appropriate means of contact and allowing the municipality to send information and documents by these means. Email will be allowed for contact purposes with an individual's consent to reduce paper usage and improve communication. And speaking of paper, municipal offices will no longer have to keep tax and assessment rolls permanently, but instead for a minimum of 10 years. Further modernization to the service of document provisions will be placed in regulations. This is to address using email and electronic portals as requested by the municipal sector. Municipalities will also have greater flexibility to publicize information on their websites instead of only posting information in the municipal office. In addition, more flexibility has been added for municipalities to determine their own mediation and dispute resolution procedures for bylaw enforcement and order to remedy, and to determine the means of sending notices of violation for bylaw contraventions. The third area of amendments is aiming at strengthening and improving local governments. A number of these amendments involve ensuring administrator and clerk positions are filled in a timely manner when vacant, or that designate offices are in place for calling a meeting if the clerk or administrator is temporarily absent. Also, the population threshold under which a certified administrator is not required will be removed so that all municipalities, regardless of size, will need a certified administrator or one working towards its certification. These positions are the backbone of any council office. They are trained to a high standard and have many responsibilities, including advising councils on their legislative responsibilities and being responsible for all municipal staff unless a council decides otherwise. Municipalities are recognized in legislation as a responsible and accountable level of government, and the amendments proposed in this bill strengthen that responsibility and accountability. A notable amendment is providing regulation making authority to require all types of municipalities to join cities and the provincial government in being transparent in their posting of their public accounts, showing council remuneration and expenditures on goods, services, and grants over certain amounts. We recognize that this change will require adjustment, so these provisions will come into force by regulations for a future financial year, following more discussion with the sector. Other amendments deal with the growing and changing populations in our rural municipalities, or RMs. In many cases, division boundaries for electing RM council members have not changed since the dawn of the province. With these proposed amendments, RM councils must adopt a policy outlining the frequency, timing, process, and criteria for reviewing their division boundaries. That way, councils will be aware of and be able to address any disparities and variances in the number of voters in each division to maintain democratic fairness. Or RMs can choose to hold elections at large, an option previously not available to them. Other amendments to improve accountability will clarify wording to ensure citizen petitions are appropriately responded to and allow the minister to issue directives as a result of the review and investigations under employment and privacy legislation. The final area of amendments proposed in this bill respond to stakeholder requests for improvements to the legislation. Councils must hold their members to a high standard to which they were elected. Councils do the all-important work of governing and making many important decisions. That is why we have included amendments that have been requested by municipalities to enhance their autonomy and flexibility in some areas. At the request of the Urban and Rural Municipal Associations, amendments give councils greater power to take action against disqualified members if these persons refuse to resign, similar to provisions that already exist for northern municipalities. Councils will also be able to adopt leave of absence policies for parental and other kinds of leave instead of passing resolutions for each individual. Also, new municipalities will have the flexibility to support green energy and other environmental improvements to properties by adding the cost of these improvements to property taxes over multiple years with the agreement of the property owner. Such programs could address energy efficiency, renewable energy, site remediation, or other environmental initiatives and priorities of councils and their residents. Similar authority is also being provided to assist homeowners with custom work, such as an initiative to replace lead pipes on private properties. Again, this would be by agreement with the property owner and was requested by our municipal stakeholders. While greater autonomy is a benefit in some areas, we as a province have been hearing concerns with an assessment appeal system that could be considered inefficient and not serving citizens as well as it could. Therefore, the bill includes authority for provincially established boards of revision and a provincial registrar of appeals to be set out in regulations. Conversations with the sector are ongoing and details need to be worked out. However, the stage is set for better coordination and improved efficiency regarding property assessment appeals. In closing, the bill makes many small but important improvements for municipalities in this province. I want to thank our municipal sector partners and associations for their participation and input over the past year in helping develop and refine the amendments proposed in this bill. It is the product of many people, groups and stakeholders, associations coming together to improve the legislation that is truly greater than the sum of its parts and to ensure these three municipal acts continue to establish a modern framework on which our many great municipalities are built and governed. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move the second reading of Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Statutes Municipal Amendment Act 2019. Thank you.
Here, here. It has been moved that Bill number 194 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the official opposition, it gives me a great pleasure to present our first position on the particular bill that has been introduced by the Minister, Bill 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Act and the changes to the Act that are being proposed by the Minister affects, as she mentioned, all the municipalities across the province, whether it's rural, or whether it's cities, or whether it's urban, and of course northern as well. So all the municipalities and the municipal structure in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, are being impacted by this particular act. And Bill 194 talks about a number of issues, and it talks about amendments to deal with population data, changes the rules regarding the suspension of a full-time city solicitor. It increases protection of city employees. It extends the period of suspension from council to from 3 to 12 years for a member held financially liable for unauthorized transactions. It changes the rules for assessment notices. It changes the rules for property tax and procedures for taxation. It allows a rural municipality to review the division boundaries of the rural municipality in the manner set forth in the Act. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it allows for changes for restructuring municipalities. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to point out at the outset that in our experience as the opposition when we were in government, and certainly continues on today, the vast majorities of municipalities, the vast majority of the municipalities throughout our province, whether they're RMs or whether they're northern villages or whether they are cities, and certainly whether they are our community, city, towns and villages, Mr. Speaker, and all the municipal structures across the province, because I know that there are some very small and some very large, that by and large, a lot of the municipalities operate very, very well. They are professional people. The councils make some very tough decisions, but they make sure that the process to making these tough decisions are honored, and that the government of Saskatchewan, and certainly the official opposition, want to thank our partners in government, Mr. Speaker, because in northern Saskatchewan, the mayor and council play a huge role in some of our communities, as do the chief and council, Mr. Speaker, but all throughout the province, whether it's a Reeve and his RM council or her RM council, or whether it's a city with the mayors and the councillors, they have a tremendous burden, Mr. Speaker. They have for years and years played a very crucial role, and many times the work is very tough, and a lot of times it's very demanding. So I want to point out from the official opposition perspective that we recognize that the vast majority, the huge majority of the municipalities throughout our province are operated efficiently, proficiently, professionally, and Mr. Speaker, with a great deal of desire for stronger and better communities being expressed by the council and the mayors. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, that's something that we want to recognize, because they do it for the good of the community, and that's something that is so crucial that we recognize and point out each and every day. So the municipal structure is our partner. We have to make sure that we respect them and work with them. And as we look at some of these acts, to make sure that they are certainly that they're collaborating with the municipal structure on some of these acts. Now, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the notion around divisional boundaries of RMs, look at the notion within the Act that the Minister is going to establish special service areas. It changes the rules for restructuring municipalities. You know, one of the things, Mr. Speaker, that the SAS party was always fear-mongering about was amalgamation. Now, Mr. Speaker, you look at what's being proposed in the bill, one would question whether amalgamation is indeed on the radar now for the current SAS party government, because it gives the minister in this particular bill a great opportunity to redistribute or to redivide boundaries, Mr. Speaker. The language is very clear. It allows the minister to establish special service areas. Again, I pointed out, changes the rules for restructuring municipalities, Mr. Speaker. So the whole notion around amalgamation, something that I know that SARM was quite dead set against, and they often spoke against that in the Assembly, Mr. Speaker. So the whole notion around amalgamation of some of the municipal bodies throughout the province, and I think SARM would be the one organization that would have the greatest impact. I wonder how they are viewing that notion within the Act itself, allowing the minister to establish special rules around restructuring municipalities, which include, of course, the RMs. Now, Mr. Speaker, we would, in the opposition, make sure we pay very, very close attention to what is being proposed by the SAS party, because let us not forget, Mr. Speaker, that part of their MO as a government is to continue to blame the NDP for every problem, Mr. Speaker, that the world has. That is basically what their MO is, Mr. Speaker. But in the meantime, they bring forward bills of this sort talking about amalgamation, the opportunity, the specter of amalgamation in this particular bill. I wonder how the RM counterparts, their RM counterparts, would certainly would feel about that particular aspect, Mr. Speaker. And as you look at some of the performance, as I mentioned, of the municipal structure, Mr. Speaker, by and large, a huge percentage of the municipal structures throughout the province operate professionally, efficiently, and Mr. Speaker, they really value their ability to govern themselves, and that is something that this government ought to learn to respect more and more and more, Mr. Speaker. That being said, Mr. Speaker, you look at the notion around the suspension from council from 3 to 12 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that there's a couple of municipalities that have been in the news recently, and we're going to have the opportunity to the committee to see exactly what the minister does as it pertains to transgressions against some of the municipal acts and some of the laws that the municipal bodies are governed by. We are currently awaiting the report from Pine House, Mr. Speaker. When is that report going to be released? We will need to see what the report is saying. So far, Mr. Speaker, not a peep from the current minister, and we are certainly waiting for that report. We want to see it, Mr. Speaker, because some of the other communities that we've seen throughout the province of Saskatchewan, the very few cases where there has been some transgressions against the Act, Mr. Speaker, they have been dealt with, and like I said at the outset, the vast majority of municipal associations and structures throughout the province operate very well. Now, we are awaiting that report, and through the committee process, we got some very pointed questions for that minister as it pertains to some of the transgressions that she spoke about in the Northern Municipalities Act. We are going to be asking the tough questions around how these matters are handled, especially if there's an implication of one of her cabinet colleagues as it pertains to issues around what laws and what processes may or may not have been followed, Mr. Speaker. These are questions that we have, and we will be asking these questions through the committee process, and I want to assure that minister that those tough questions will be forthcoming, and that if she is serious about some of the issues around amalgamation that she's speaking about, then she better be serious about some of the other issues that we have certainly been hearing about throughout the news. Now, as I pointed out, Mr. Speaker, there are tons of questions we have around some of the very few cases where there has been some transgressions against the Municipalities Act. Again, as I pointed it out, my colleague from Saskatoon Centre has been diligently waiting for information around the specific issue on the Pine House matter, Mr. Speaker. I understand that there is a report being presented or may have been completed or is in the government's hands. We are anxiously awaiting what day that they'll release it. Mr. Speaker, it's so very important that we get that information, because all of this hinges on what the bill itself is talking about. It's recognizing not only the good work of the municipalities that are indeed doing work, but how they would handle the very few partners in governance, if I can call them, the very few areas where sometimes the municipalities make an error in judgment, and certainly there are rules and regulations that must be followed, and we want to make sure that that process is robust in the sense of being transparent by releasing the report in a timely fashion, by not trying to cover up some of their involvement as ministers of the Crown in some of the past activities. We want to know what's going on there. We are anxious for that report, Mr. Speaker, and certainly the question that we'll have of the minister during committee, whether it be during the Committee of Finance or whether it's during the examination of the bills or through the assembly process, those questions are coming for the minister, and my advice to her is she better be ready to answer the questions as succinctly and, Mr. Speaker, and to the point as possible, because we got a lot of questions on some of the involvement of that party in terms of some of the transgressions that were allowed under certain municipal structures. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of questions we're going to have. We're going to continue asking the tough questions on some of these bills. The changes in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, are profound. There are pages and pages and pages of changes being proposed, and I would suggest to somebody that may want to review and research this particular bill that there is quite a bit of work ahead of them, as our staff is currently doing much of that work already and have completed 90% of their work. Mr. Speaker, we are still concerned on some of the aspects of this bill that really lend credence to our argument that the Saskatchewan party have been so busy, Mr. Speaker, talking about the carbon tax, which we don't support, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the Assembly, that they want to deflect from their current mismanagement, the mess around the Regina bypass, the mess around the GTH, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that after all these years, about all the current government had to do was just spend the money that was plopped on their lap as a government, because when they came government in 2007, all this money was around. All they had to do was spend the money, be political in how they spend, drive our province into debt, Mr. Speaker, and about all they do nowadays is criticize the NDP. And if that's good enough to form government, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell the people this. Let the historical record show the financial mess that this government is leaving these provinces for our children and great-grandchildren to figure out. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, they have got to go. They have got to go because they've made a mess out of something that they inherited. And how in the heck do you do that, Mr. Speaker? You have a growing population, you got $2.5 billion in the bank, you got a reduced debt, a significantly reduced debt, you got a booming economy, and somehow the current government, the Saskatchewan Party government, messed that up, Mr. Speaker, and now we're seeing record debt, we're seeing record taxation, and we're still seeing a huge mess in healthcare and education, Mr. Speaker, because the Saskatchewan Party or the Conservatives are one of the same. They do not know how to govern, Mr. Speaker. They never did know how to govern. About all they do is spend the money that the people of Saskatchewan and the NDP left them, and that all they do is complain about the NDP. And, Mr. Speaker, the sad reality is that that's what they think. That's all it takes is to govern, is to criticize the other party, Mr. Speaker. And I say to them, shame on them. Shame on them, and that's why the financial mess will be their legacy. And, Mr. Speaker, I point out again, to me, it is something that the other partners that I spoke about in this particular bill, the municipal structure ought to be very careful when it comes to dealing with the Saskatchewan Party government when it talks about restructuring and penalties and the minister conferring certain powers to herself to make decisions impacting all the municipal partners throughout the province of Saskatchewan. So be very worried, Mr. Speaker, about some of the changes being proposed, and I want to put the minister on notice that we got a ton of questions for her and a ton of other questions for the Saskatchewan Party government on how they deal with transgressions to the municipal act that she's speaking about. But I want to reiterate, the vast majority of the municipal bodies in this province operate very well. They operate very well. They're very good partners, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to enjoy their volunteerism, their effort to build their community, and their commitment to their electors, whether it's an RM, whether it's a northern municipality, whether it's a resort village, or whether it is a city. So, Mr. Speaker, it is important that we recognize them, thank them, and put the minister on notice that we're watching very carefully what she does with this act, because there are some very concerning statements and very concerning powers that she's taken as her own right to decide, and that is something that we are going to watch very carefully. So we have other comments on this bill. I look forward to some of my colleagues and their statement on this particular bill, so that we can tell the people of Saskatchewan to warn them of what the Sask Party agenda has always been, and is that to bring forward the notion of amalgamation. Mr. Speaker, this bill suggested, and I dare say to the people of Saskatchewan, especially the RMs, watch out. The Saskatchewan Party are talking amalgamation, and that is something that they want to do, and I suspect that they will do, Mr. Speaker. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on this particular bill, Bill 194, and I so move.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
Hang on, sorry, I haven't got you. Sorry. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you. I'll enter in with fairly brief remarks on Bill number 179. I won't ask for extended leave at this point, but I'm happy to enter into discussion as it relates to the Apiary Amendment Act. But that's a tough act to follow, Mr. Speaker. When you see the member for Athabasca stand on his feet and retell the history of this province and the history, same old story of the Tories opposite, Mr. Speaker, it's great to have a little bit of some of the facts laid down. But I'd like to focus in on the Apiary Act, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I don't know a whole lot about bees, but like the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre, I am a bit of a honey lover, Mr. Speaker. I've also got a fondness for mead, Mr. Speaker, and so I greatly value the the importance of honey production in Saskatchewan, and not to be light on these matters, honey production is very important to this province, very important to agriculture within Saskatchewan. I have a friend and my colleague, the member for Regina Northeast, who is as close as you get to a bee expert in this province, Mr. Speaker. If you can imagine, before serving as an MLA, he was the president of the Regina and District Beekeepers Association, Mr. Speaker. He's also, if you call the bee hotline, Mr. Speaker, the swarm hotline in Regina, you get the member for Regina Northeast out to your place to respond to your swarm. And he will, I would try, if it's 3 in the morning, the member for Regina, for Weyburn is asking whether or not he'd ask at all hours of the night. I believe he's there, Mr. Speaker, to respond at all hours of the night, and I would urge my friends opposite to maybe test that out a little bit, maybe in the last week of session here, to respond to any concerns. Certainly, honey production in Saskatchewan is important. Beekeeping is important. To make sure we have effective laws, Mr. Speaker, and regulations, it's critical that government work directly with the industry in a consultative way, and I'm not certain that that's what's gone on as the work to bring about this bill. We sure hope that's the case. Certainly, the official opposition will be out there consulting with the industry to make sure that the changes that are brought forward are as effective as they can be, that they put this industry and this important industry on a solid footing today, and ultimately for generations moving forward, Mr. Speaker. I will be consulting, we'll be listening, we invite input from the industry. At this, I don't profess to be any sort of a bee expert at all. I'll leave that to the member for Regina Northeast. I know more about Barry B. Benson, Mr. Speaker, from the famous movie Bees, because I have a 5-year-old, so I've been watching that movie a fair amount over the last number of years. This is the story of where Barry B. Benson sues humans for the exploitation at the hands of humans. It's a good movie, Mr. Speaker. I'd recommend it to you if you're looking for a good flick, good soundtrack to go along with it, and William, my little guy, he sure likes it. But with that being said, Mr. Speaker, we'll be consulting with the industry and doing all we can to make sure that this legislation is as effective as possible.
Is the member from Regina Rosemont?
Just have another half an hour. I'd like to enter in on this bill. Joking, Mr. Speaker, I would like to adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act.
The member from Regina Rosemont has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 179. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Orders adjourn debates. Item number 7. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 180, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations, Transfer of Gas, Electrical and Plumbing Functions, Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, my colleague from Rosemont is a bit of a troublemaker. Oh, Mr. Speaker, my apologies. I am pleased to enter the debate. I was always the child in church who had the giggles, for the record, so I'm trying to suppress that here. This is a serious conversation. I'm pleased to enter the debate on Bill number 180, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations, Transfer of Gas, Electrical and Plumbing Functions Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, it's always good to look to the minister's second reading speech to have a sense of where the government is coming from on a bill, and then this is the time in the legislative session where the bills are introduced, the minister speaks to them, and we have an opportunity to to reach out and consult with those who are impacted by legislation, and the bills are often passed in the spring, Mr. Speaker. But in the minister's second reading speech, she points out that if this bill is passed, it implements government's decision to transfer responsibility for gas, electrical and plumbing licensing and inspection functions to the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan, or TSASC, and place all that regulated legislation under the responsibility of government relations, Mr. Speaker. This particular piece of legislation is following up on the government's announcement last December in 2018 that they would be in fact transferring all gas, electrical and plumbing inspections, licensing and permitting, and that this will unfold in the next 2 years, Mr. Speaker. One thing that's always really important when legislation is before us, Mr. Speaker, is to figure out why the legislation is before us, who asked for it, has the government reached out and talked to appropriate bodies, people impacted by the legislation. Just going back to the minister's second reading speech, she does say it's always good to hear with whom the government says they're consulting, and then we have an opportunity to confirm that, Mr. Speaker, both in conversations in committee. The minister does mention that consultations with industry and trade associations took place over 2017 and 2018 regarding improving the delivery of these services, and she points out that both electrical and mechanical contractors associations of Saskatchewan support the delivery of these services by TSASC and the creation of a single point of contact for contractors, industry and the public. And I know just through brief conversations with folks I know who work in this industry, there's the consensus or the agreement that one point of contact would be nice, Mr. Speaker, for sure. I've heard that. And the minister points out that internally the Minister of Government Relations has also been doing some collaboration with the Ministries of Justice and Health and Sask Power and TSASC since 2018, both on the amendments in this bill, but also to try to make sure that there is a seamless transfer and transition of services once the bill is passed. So these, at first blush, seem like reasonable changes, Mr. Speaker. There's always concern, obviously, safety and value. Is there safety and value in having a one-stop shop? Quite possibly, Mr. Speaker. There's always the concern with this government around privatization and them moving along that direction, Mr. Speaker. This is a government who likes to take things out of the purview of the direct government organizations and move them into outside of government, Mr. Speaker. So that is definitely a concern and something to watch for sure with this government. But I know that the critic responsible for this bill and the opposition in general will be reaching out and doing our due diligence to make sure this bill meets the needs of both consumers and the tradespeople who work in this industry, Mr. Speaker. But with that, at this point in time, I would like to move adjournment of debate for Bill number 180. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn a debate on Bill number 180. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates item number 8. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. To join in adjourn debates on Bill 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Before I get into it, I know they're modernizing it. They're putting it online. From my understanding, when I look in here, they're going to be taking the taxation part of it and formula. They're making comments on if it will be the same. There's not going to be much changes. So it almost, and I know we're going to have some questions about this, but it was interesting because they introduced legislation, I believe, in April. So from April, and it was passed, a bill. And if I get that right, I think it's the same name, I thought even. And if they didn't, I'm wondering why now are they introducing this, and if there's changes, or what was the reason why that bill's coming back. Now, I've had different comments about it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, thinking about, if a government is having trouble at the end of the day with bringing in legislation that's crucial, to this Assembly. And the good work, it's supposed to be representing the good people of the province. We have many areas of this province that are seeing troubles. When I look at health care, I look at education, I look at the bill that was introduced, suicide prevention strategy for the province. Government could take on some of those challenges and introduce legislation that is meaningful and putting people first and residents. And the government could do that, but it just shows sometimes when you see the bills and the legislation that they're bringing forward, you wonder, like, is the government, are they old, are they tired, out of ideas? Like, there's something going on because you don't see much on here. I mean, in some of them, I understand. Maybe people have requested and they need to be done, and that's fine. I understand that when organizations, residents of our province ask the government to do that, they should do that. And that might happen. And I'm not sure who all was consulted on part of this legislation. They talk about, well, they did some consultation work, but I know we'll have an opportunity to consult with individuals, and I know the critics will take the time, and they'll have an opportunity to reach out with legislation to find out who and how, with those in the mining industry, how will this affect them? How will it, is it in any way going to have any positive or negative especially with the mining industry right now, and when we talk about minerals, and you see the mining sector and the challenges that they're faced. I know the North has been devastated by, Cameco, and you see the challenges that are faced there. Whether it's potash, there's so many different areas, that we see, areas are being affected. So we're not sure where they're going and why they're coming forward with it. So I know my colleagues will have some serious questions. I know that for a fact. But going back to that, you kind of like to go back and forth, and I'm hoping that government, as I said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is hearing Saskatchewan residents are very concerned about education, health care, about putting them first, the most vulnerable, housing issues. We see so many people struggling with, losing their job, employment. We see what the PST has done to the construction industry, and they could use some support and legislation that the government could introduce that would maybe reverse their decision on the PST. There's opportunities that a government could be hearing and listening to Saskatchewan people, and the construction trades have made it very clear. We've heard from different organizations that the PST, when it comes to construction and real estate, and that it's devastating them, the jobs. We talk about our, the trades, and you see how many people are leaving the province. My colleague, the man from Rosemount, gets up lots every day just about and talks about the PST, how it's damaging the economy, how it's hurting. When there's an industry going down and the numbers weren't going good, you put that on industry and you kill it. And what's the purpose of it? So if the government has, and it isn't old and tired and out of ideas, we've got some ideas for them, and we're willing to work. And I said that, and I mean this with the most concern for Saskatchewan residents when it comes to the Suicide Act, a bill that I have introduced. The government could work with us, and I'm hoping they will work with us. 618. There's a bill that really Saskatchewan people would love to see a government work together and have legislation working with the opposition to say, let's make that a priority so that we don't lose any more lives, or we do all we can to make sure we don't lose any more lives. You do what you can. And I think about many different areas where we're hearing concerns from Saskatchewan residents. Our seniors, long-term care homes. I see back home that there's an area government could really focus on with legislation. Looking at, we look at our seniors and the care that they're being provided in a long-term home. Certain standards and making sure that seniors are being taken care of with staffing and making sure the levels of staffing are there to provide the good care. Having said that, I'm just hoping one day maybe this government will introduce legislation that truly, like I said, is meaningful to those people of this great province who are asking a government to take care of the needs that they're seeing, and having a government do what they need to do to take care of the needs that the residents who put government. And you remember, you have to work. And we all say this, and I know back home it's an honor to serve the riding that and the constituency that I represent, and you have to do the good work and you earn the people's vote. I think this government needs to do some work, and you can't take it for granted. And they need to do some serious work on some of the legislation, some of the challenges we see with the most vulnerable, and we hear, things come up. There's where they can introduce some serious legislation that's helping individuals, and I think the government could do that if they want to earn the votes of people, and we'll see. I think they're taking it for granted, and I think someday they're going to get the message from the people of our province. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, I don't have a lot more to say on this bill, so I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill 181.
The member from Cumberland has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 174, the Maintenance of Enforcement Orders Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again, good to join debate this afternoon on Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, the start of the Minister's second reading speech dwells at some length on the record of the Maintenance Enforcement Branch of the Ministry of Justice. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, in my experience, that is praise that is given with good reason. In terms of the dealings that my constituency office has had on behalf of constituents in Regina Elphinstone Centre on matters of maintenance enforcement, dealing with the branch has been very productive and a very effective exercise on behalf of the people of Elphinstone Centre. So I just want to get in right at the top here, Mr. Speaker, and say please keep up the good work to the Maintenance Enforcement Branch and the folks doing that work every day. The Minister talked about Saskatchewan having one of the highest collection rates in Canada, wherein nearly $47 million was collected in the last fiscal for children and families, and that the branch is on pace to collect $50 million in the current fiscal year, and that there are presently 9,000 active orders and agreements registered with the office. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of staggering to think that each one of those orders represents a family, and the way that our matrimonial law and property law has evolved to the point where, again, we've got tens of millions of dollars at stake in terms of maintenance enforcement and in terms of the 9,000 families and orders that represents, Mr. Speaker, and the importance of those orders to the well-being of children and families around this province, Mr. Speaker. The legislation itself is setting out to keep abreast of changes in language, to revise the definition of maintenance order to include maintenance that has been awarded through arbitration and orders recalculated by the recalculation office, Mr. Speaker. And of course, where else would you do the recalculations but the recalculation office? And to allow the court to collect banking information for an accurate calculation of the payment due. So, Mr. Speaker, this is in some ways an updating of the legislation. It provides better regulatory framework for a highly effective, highly important arm of government situated over in the enforcement branch in the Ministry of Justice. So on the face of it, this legislation would seem to be well placed. We'll of course be doing our work of due diligence and consultation, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that everything is as it seems to be. And we'll be headed up in that regard by our able justice critic, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But at this time, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 174. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You know, there's a lot of bills that we enter into debate on second reading where you know, it's fairly technical, fairly mundane. You know, there's not a lot of stuff to talk about, and you know, there's sometimes it gives rise to us talking about political things. I mean, you know, for instance, I could get up here and I could talk about how light the legislative agenda is this session, and how there's a lot of housekeeping and mundane stuff and a lot of tinkering, but overall the message we're getting from the government is that everything's fine and that they've done enough. And of course that does fit with the government's message that everything's fine, but they're ignoring the problems in our province, the overcrowded hospitals and long-term care facilities, the problems that my colleague from Prince Albert Northcote was highlighting in social services today. So I could talk about that stuff, but in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, I actually want to dig into the technical aspects of this amending statute. Mr. Speaker, in the minister's opening comments, second reading speech, the minister made note of protecting people from predatory marriages. And one of the changes that this bill does is it removes the ability of somebody who's under the age of 16 to get married. So it used to be that it was possible, but you needed a court order. Now that's going to be impossible. And I don't think you'd have any issue with that from this side of the House. I think we can all agree that society in Saskatchewan has come to the point where no one under the age of 16 should be getting married anymore. I suspect you'd have a high amount of agreement on both sides of the House on that issue, if not unanimity. But Mr. Speaker, I find myself scratching my head at several aspects of this bill, but where they chose to draw the line. Because, for instance, Mr. Speaker, in Section 25, it talks about what consent is required for someone who's under the age of 18 to get married. And so, you know, as the parent of you know, two children, one of whom has just passed the age of 18 and one of whom is still under the age of 18, you know, I can't help but think in my own situation, I'm like, what are my kids, you know, and ready to get married? And of course the answer is no. And I look around to my, you know, to my friends, my neighbors, my colleagues, you know, their kids who I've seen growing up, and I'm thinking, would any of them, you know, should any of them be getting married under the age of 18? And of course the answer is a resounding no. So I can see why we would want parental consent there, Mr. Speaker. That's really important. But here's the curious part, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's two provisions in Section 25 that say if you are under the age of 18, you don't need parental consent if you've already been married and you've been widowed or you're a widower. And I thought, well, why should those youngsters not need parental consent? Or the other restriction is, if you're under the age of 18 and you didn't get parental consent, but you've had sex and you've lived together as husband and wife, then you don't need parental consent. And I thought, well, like, what an antiquated notion, Mr. Speaker. And although I would love to say with confidence that my kids haven't had sex, Mr. Speaker, I was once under the age of 18 a few years ago, And society has moved away from this. And the notion that anything should turn on whether a teenager has had sexual relations, that notion really is out of keeping with our with modern day society, Mr. Speaker. Frankly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the notions that are in the existing legislation in subsection 6 and subsection 7 of section 25 that are continued after the amendments, those are, I suspect, rooted in the notion that once you've had sex, you're just damaged goods. And that's a little patriarchal, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I think it's time that there's no reason to maintain subsection 6 and subsection 7 of section 25 of the Marriage Act. There's no need for those subsections anymore. Now, on one hand, I was looking at these and thinking, well, you know, maybe they just didn't look at those subsections, and that's why they got left in there. But no, that's not the case, because the bill does actually amend subsection 7. So they directly looked at subsection 7. And I've got to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I just find this carrying forward of these antiquated, very patriarchal notions very troubling. Also on that point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have the language husband and wife in the Marriage Act, and that language is maintained. Despite, Mr. Speaker, despite it having been ruled since 2004 that same-sex couples can get married. So despite that ruling, despite the court saying since 2004 that same-sex couples have the right to get married, this bill maintains the language that directs a commissioner of marriage to pronounce to couples that they're now going to be husband and wife, even if it happens to be 2 men or 2 women. And that is also a little antiquated. We've moved past that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's time, we're amending the Act. It's time that language get updated as well. It's now been 15 years since same-sex couples could get married. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Section 32 of the Marriage Act was the section before that dealt with the court's ability to declare a marriage to be a nullity, where one of the parties or both the parties had been minors, and where there hadn't been the legal consent. Now, Mr. Speaker, I see that the bill is adding a new section, Section 32.1, that allows the court to nullify a marriage where the parties have not consented, and it also brings in who can bring that action. So now a parent, now the public guardian, or somebody with a close personal connection, all of those people now can bring that application, that action to the court, asking that a marriage be nullified. My question about that is, when I look at Section 30, the new Section 32.1 that this bill will introduce, is it makes the old Section 32 completely redundant. And so I wonder, Mr. Deputy Speaker, why are we keeping the old Section 32? Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are also some other provisions that I'm a little curious about. I noticed that the regulations will no longer prescribe a fee for marriage commissioners. So basically, it's wide open, and I don't really know what the existing market is right now, but obviously the government feels that they no longer need to regulate what a marriage commissioner can charge to a couple. And I'm curious what the rationale is for that, if there's some actual evidence of concern or if it's just an ideological belief. But I definitely have questions. Now, one of the really big significant changes of this bill is actually a change to the Wills Act and to people's estate planning. So it has been the law for decades, if not longer, that once you got married, that automatically nullified or revoked any former wills that you made. And once the laws were changed back after the turn of the century in the early 2000s, the law became that if you lived common law for 2 years, once common law couples were accorded the same treatment as married couples, if you became common law for 2 years, that also revoked your will. And I must confess, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I had a great deal of difficulty with that law. I thought that was worked an unfairness to a lot of people, people who might have been living common law for decades. All of a sudden, because the law changed, their wills would have been revoked without them really being aware of it. Because I don't think this is common knowledge that happened. So, in a sense, you know, if this proposal with the Wills Act had happened back in the early 2000s, I would have been very supportive of it. I'm a little more concerned about it because now, again, we're doing a complete 180 on the law. It's a provision that not a lot of people know about. And so my fear is that there are going to be people caught unawares by this change in the law, and it's going to work a hardship. Now, I've reflected on this, and really what we have is competing concerns. On one side, we've got people who are spouses potentially being cut out of wills, and on the other side, we've got people who aren't spouses, possibly adult children or friends, or possibly even organizations being cut out of wills. And when I weigh those two competing notions, I think the government probably has made the right choice right now in choosing to nullify the wills, to not nullify the wills, because a spouse always has the ability to challenge the estate either through the Family Property Act or through the Dependents Relief Act. But adult children and organizations and friends, they don't have that same ability. So although this will probably work to a hardship for some people who are caught unawares, I think it's probably the best saw-off that we as legislators can do. With that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure of what the ministry's reasons are for presenting this bill and drawing the lines where they have. But it does raise lots of concerns, lots of questions, lots of material to explore in committee. You know, one of the things I noticed that's still in there is it talks about persons. Again, this would be young persons who need somebody's consent being physically examined by a medical practitioner, and you know that also gives me great concern. And I certainly hope that what that is talking about is not the notion that you can tell somebody's virginity from a physical examination. I certainly hope that that's not what that provision is about. But in any case, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill draws some very curious lines in changing the law, and I think we'll have to be digging into this further. At the minimum, there are some very antiquated and patriarchal assumptions and notions in this bill, or in the old law, that have not been removed by the amendments proposed in this bill, and I'm quite troubled by that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to move that we adjourn debate on Bill 175.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 3. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 176, the Fiduciaries Access to Digital Information Act. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This bill deals with a subject area that occupied a fair chunk of my legal practice when I was doing that full time, which is estate planning. And so I have some observations based on that experience. And the first observation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that this bill probably isn't necessary. And by that I say that my suspicion is that it is already the law that people who have a power of attorney, people who are executors, people who are property guardians, those fiduciaries, that they already have the legal power to access what this bill terms as digital assets. So that's my first observation. Now, I haven't done a recent search of the case law to determine whether there's been any judicial decisions on this recently, but certainly, the notion is in law that executors, property guardians, and attorneys have broad, wide-ranging powers, and in many cases, nearly the identical powers to the person whose estate they're administering. On that point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's two types of powers of attorney. There's either a contingent power of attorney that only takes effect at some later date in time. Usually that later date is when the person granting it becomes incapacitated. But there's also a power of attorney that just takes effect immediately from the moment that you sign that power of attorney. And lots of people who are perfectly healthy, who have capacity, sign a power of attorney that takes effect immediately because they don't want the person with whom they are entrusting their affairs, they don't want that person to have to go through the hassle and the inconvenience of tracking down a couple of medical opinions to determine whether they're incapacitated. And I raise this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because the bill says that it doesn't distinguish between those two types of powers of attorney. It just says that if you are a property attorney, that you would have these powers that the bill gives over digital assets. And I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that most people would be surprised to learn that if they had given somebody an immediate power of attorney, that person could go to SaskTel or Access and access their email account without them being incapacitated. So I think people would be surprised to find that out. Now, the reality is, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that really everybody should go through this planning exercise. Everybody should be, consciously thinking about, how they're going to plan their estate, plan for their incapacity, plan for their death. But of course, the reality is that doesn't happen. There's lots of people who put that off, who procrastinate, and so what this bill is talking about is the people who don't do that planning, who haven't really drawn their attention to what's going to happen to their email accounts and so on. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill is really about setting what the default is, and setting the default rule when a person hasn't drawn their mind and expressed their wishes. Are their fiduciary going to have access to their digital assets, or are they not? Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do have I do have possibly a few concerns about this bill. So the first is that I fear that we're creating a bit of a double or a two-tier system, I guess you might say. Because, of course, all that we can do in this Assembly and in this legislature, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all we can do is pass laws that relate to Saskatchewan. And so if this bill becomes law, it will apply to SaskTel, and it will apply to Access Communications, and it will apply to Shaw, but it's not going to apply to Facebook. It's not going to apply to Instagram. It's not going to apply to Snapchat. It's not going to apply to Microsoft, and it's not going to apply to Apple. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reality is that most of our digital assets, if you use that term from the bill, that's where those assets reside, is outside of Saskatchewan. So we're going to have one set of rules that apply to SaskTel and Access, and another set of rules that apply to other people. Another concern, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is this is a fairly technical area. Is the public going to know? What steps are is the government going to take to make sure that the public are aware of these changes and to make sure that public are informed about this? Sorry, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm just taking a moment to review my notes here. My last concern on this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is there's one category of information that it's not entirely clear right now which type of fiduciary has the rights to it, or whether it's overlapping, and that's medical information. So we have the advanced directive law that gives your medical proxy the right to access your medical information if you are incapacitated, and it also has a pecking order for next of kin if you haven't given a proxy. But that specifically deals with medical information. And so it's not clear right now whether someone who has a property power of attorney, or is a property guardian, or I guess it wouldn't apply to executors, whether someone who is a property attorney or a property guardian, whether they would have the right to access digital medical information. And so, to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it seems like this bill hasn't really clarified that situation at all. And that's probably an area that does need to be clarified. It does need a bright line decided. Is it the proxy, or is it the attorney or the guardian who has the right to access the medical information of the person who is living but incapacitated? So, with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to end my comments here and move that the consideration of Bill 176 be adjourned.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 176. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 4. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like always, it's a pleasure to join in with regards to debate on amendments for bills being brought forward. And this one in particular was of interest to myself because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this amends probably about over 40 acts with regards to occupational professional organizations, and it's to ensure that the registry is available to the public, including in electronic format. Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the acts is the Social Workers Act, and I'm a registered social worker, so I would be covered underneath that act. I feel it's really important to continue to have my be a registered social worker and be regulated under the Social Workers Act, because there is a responsibility that comes with a license like that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and the responsibility is to ensure that you're practicing within the rules set out by the province as well as the profession and the code of ethics that comes along with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So along with ensuring that I abide by the code of ethics as a social worker, but also continuing my education hours is also important to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I don't take that lightly. And I think a lot of the other occupational and professional organizations that are regulated under this Act feel the same way, and individuals who work in those professions realize how important it is that they be regulated under this piece of legislation. And I think a lot of people, the general public, they may not know that in certain professions, some people are legislated underneath these acts and some people aren't. And that's why it's very important that they have access to this information. If I was looking for a physiotherapist or if I was looking for a psychologist, I would also want to know that they were regulated underneath these pieces of legislation, because then I know that they're held under a certain level of code of conduct, and I could expect that to be related to the practice that they provide to me. And so the changes within this piece of legislation will set out a basic criteria for self-regulation and gives organizations the authority to create bylaws as well. And the professional legalization ensures that the public is protected when using services and members are regulated by an overseeing body. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we make changes as such to these pieces of legislation, it's really important that we contact all of the individuals who will be impacted by the changes. And with this affecting over 40 different acts, that'll be a bit time-consuming, but I think very worthwhile to ensure that these organizations know the changes that are coming forward. But also it's important to look at other logistics and contact other agencies that might have an opinion on what these changes are. And one of them is the Office of the Saskatchewan Information and Privacy Commissioner. It's good to get some feedback from him as well. And so some of the information he's provided of suggestions that he would like to see with regards to changes to this legislation is he's actually suggesting that he would like to see this expanded a bit more. He indicates that it's very important to ensure that individuals in our province can access this information, and having an electronic ability to do that is very important, because a lot of people can't go to the actual offices of these organizations. And so being able to allow people more access is important, but he's also indicating here that maybe if we extend some of these amendments, that we could also include when a person goes in to look at what the professional, if the professional is regulated under that act, it could also indicate whether their license status, so whether they're active, suspended, or revoked. They could also indicate whether this individual has restrictions on their practice, whether there are any current or past disciplinary proceedings and the results of those. And so those are recommendations from the Office of the Saskatchewan Information and Privacy Commissioner, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So I think that will be something of interest to have discussion at committee about. I know the minister responsible for this piece of legislation, the Minister of Justice, has gotten this letter from the Saskatchewan Information and Privacy Commissioner, and also our critic on this side, and a few other people who have been having some involvement with this piece of legislation. So he makes reference to a lawyer in the province if you're wanting to go on the Law Society website and find a lawyer. You just type in that person's name and all that information comes. So it's not that this is something that's new. It's a practice that's already being implemented, and I think his recommendations were very good. And so with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know this is a really important piece of legislation, so it should be reviewed thoroughly, and I know I have other colleagues who'd want to put their remarks on the record, and I know the critic responsible for this piece of legislation will do her due diligence in contacting stakeholders and asking questions at committee. So with that, I adjourn debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The member from Prince Albert Northcote has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statute Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 5. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Utana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to enter into the debate on Bill 178. We've had many of our members comment on the interesting lists that show up in these bills of, in this case, obsolete and private statutes. I certainly want to address one of the bills that is being repealed here. It's a private act, and it's in Section 6. This is an act that is exactly 100 years old, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's an act that was to, the original act was an act to incorporate Les Sœurs de Notre-Dame de la Croix, which is the Sisters of Our Lady of the Cross that were formed. I did a little research on them, Mr. Speaker, and they were actually formed in the 1840s as a religious order in France, and they were a French I want to say set of nuns, but I can't remember what the word is for a group of nuns. Anyways, an order, a religious order. Thank you very much to my colleague. So this was a religious order that was established in the 1840s with a young girl named Adele, who was a prayerful and zealous girl. And her mom recognized this. They had some money, so they organized this religious order. The interesting piece through the 1800s in France, Mr. Speaker, is that politics and religion were very, very closely intertwined. There was no separation of church and state in France in those years, Mr. Speaker. And as the Republican-style government came more and more into power through, I suppose, the Napoleonic Wars and that part of our history, of France's history, religious orders became more and more persecuted. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the history of that, because this affects Saskatchewan directly. In 1902, Emile Combes was elected Prime Minister of France, and he was determined to thoroughly defeat Catholicism. So after a short while in office, he closed down all parochial schools in France, and then he had Parliament reject authorization of all religious institutes. This is 1902. All religious institutes were wiped out. So this meant 54 orders were dissolved, and about 20,000 members immediately left France. So we had 20,000 members of religious orders that were shut down completely by the Republican president of the day. So where would these poor nuns go, Mr. Speaker? And you might be wondering, how did they find a new life? So many of them in 1902 came across to Canada, and they actually formed an order in the town of Forget, in the southeastern part of the province. And I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to visit there, Mr. Speaker, but it's a lovely church. There's a beautiful walking area where the old convent used to be that these poor nuns established. And I think, here's these nuns coming from the Alps in France, in the most beautiful country, and they end up in Forget, Saskatchewan, in the cold winter blowing snow that we all know so familiarly here in Saskatchewan. And they were devoted to education. These were teachers. There was, as I said, and member opposite is mentioning someone that went to school over there. Oh, his father actually went to school there. These nuns were devoted to education and, of course, to their faith. But if you think of 20,000 members of religious orders being scattered across the world, and then some of them ending up in Fort Jay, Saskatchewan, obviously that's a story, and that's part of our history here in Saskatchewan. And so in 1919, obviously, they were incorporated, they were incorporated by this 100-year-old statute, and they did the Lord's business as they saw fit for many, many years. And I also went to a convent in my hometown of La Flèche, and that was just the Sisters of the Cross. This bill is for the Sisters of Our Lady of the Cross. So as you know, there are many different religious orders that were devoted to education, but I think we need to pay tribute to the nuns who did that teaching. I know Sister Jean St. Paul was my piano teacher. She taught me all the way up to my grade 10 in piano. She also taught my mother her grade 10 in piano. And I think of the many happy days in the convent in La Flèche where Nikki DeCap and Sam Whitby and Nadine Belcourt and I got to go down for our piano lessons every day, and we would get together with Sister Jean on Fridays and have a little band experience. And so her devotion to music and to students was immeasurable, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to pay tribute to these nuns and these devoted educators who perilously would have crossed the ocean in 1902 to come to a completely new country and take up where they left off in France when they were basically shut down for religious reasons, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know, I'm sure many members have had an opportunity to visit the story of the nuns continues in Fort Jay. There's a restaurant there now called the Happy Nun that was established by Shannon and Don Chicago a few years ago. I think currently the proprietors are Leon and Gayla Gilbertson. Shannon also established the Ananda Art House, and there's a beautiful bed and breakfast where you can go and stay in the old rectory, Mr. Speaker, and there's many, many musical friends that I have in Fort Jay. Michelle Amy, who runs the Kenosi Lake Kitchen Party, and Donna Turk and her husband Morgan, who are respectively violin or fiddle and guitar teachers, and it's really a town full of music and the arts. So just want to pay a little tribute to these amazing nuns who left their homes to come to Saskatchewan in 1902, and although we're repealing their act to incorporate, I know their influence and their impact on Saskatchewan will continue. So at that point, I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 178.
The member from Saskatoon-Utana has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourned debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my privilege to weigh in on the debate today on the Fisheries Act 2019, Bill number 183, Mr. Speaker. This particular piece of legislation, as I always say, it's a good idea to refer to the minister's second reading speech to see where the government is coming from on a particular piece of legislation, and then between now and the spring session, we get the opportunity to see if that matches up with the thoughts and experiences of people who will be impacted by the legislation, Mr. Speaker. But the minister responsible for this bill, he points out that this particular bill, the Fisheries Act 2019, some of the pieces are increasing the authority to respond to prohibited and aquatic invasive species. I think about zebra mussels, Mr. Speaker, which has been a challenge here in Saskatchewan and other parts of the country too. We see the signs along the highways telling us to clean our watercraft before putting them into Saskatchewan waters here, Mr. Speaker. He points out that this bill provides authority to enable the development of environmental code chapters, providing the minister with the authority to appoint members of the Fisheries Advisory Committee, and adding provisions to protect provincial aquatic species at risk that are not currently protected under federal legislation, Mr. Speaker. Just a few little things here. It adds new definitions like aquatic invasive species. So just for people's information, aquatic invasive species will be defined as aquatic species listed as an aquatic invasive species in the regulations, so it will be outlined in the regulations, Mr. Speaker, and the definition of aquatic species at risk will be aquatic species at risk means any species that is native to Saskatchewan waters and designated and listed pursuant to Section 27 as extirpated, endangered, threatened, or of special concern. It also adds a definition for watercraft, Mr. Deputy Speaker. A watercraft includes a boat, a canoe, a kayak, a dinghy, or any other water-based vessel, Mr. Speaker. It changes some definitions, so the new definition of wild fish will be any fish that is native in Saskatchewan waters or any fish that has been introduced into Saskatchewan waters. So those just are a few of those changes, Mr. Speaker. One thing that we always talk about here is consultation. Whenever a bill comes before the legislature, it's so important to make sure that whomever that legislation might be impacting, whether it's individuals, whether it's businesses, whether it's organizations, it's always important to make sure that when creating and crafting legislation that it's connected to people's realities and that you've taken into consideration through considered consultation all the intended consequences, but you also look for what else might happen, those unintended consequences that sometimes when you get a group of the same people thinking about a piece of legislation, or anything for that matter, Mr. Speaker, that sense of groupthink, we don't always think outside of the box or think about things that don't impact us. So that's why consulting broadly and thoroughly is always so important. And the minister points out in his second reading speech that the ministry engaged with First Nations and Métis communities. He doesn't specify whether that included consultation with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, on which First Nations and Métis communities to which the ministry spoke. So that's an important piece that'll happen here in the next few months, Mr. Speaker, reaching out and finding out with whom the minister spoke, and if need be, that question will be asked at committee. The minister points out that the consultation, there was engagement with the Fisheries Advisory Committee and other stakeholders, so it's important to clarify with whom the ministry and the minister spoke about this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, and the developments that will undoubtedly impact people, possibly and hopefully positively here in Saskatchewan, but it's our job to make sure we've covered our bases, Mr. Speaker. But with respect to Bill number 183, I know at one point our environment critic will weigh in on this debate, and my other colleagues as well, and we'll have a chance in committee at some point. But for now, I would like to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019.
The member from Saskatoon Riversdale has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 183. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debates on the second reading motion on Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My comments will be brief here on Bill number 184, the Fisheries Consequential Amendments Act 2019, even more brief than previously, Mr. Speaker. It's basically a companion bill to Bill 184, updating references and definitions in other bilingual acts that relate to this one, or the previous bill, Mr. Speaker. For example, there's a new section there's a section of interestingly enough, the bill named the Fisheries Act with the consequential amendments. There's actually an amendment to the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Act, Mr. Speaker, and the piece that's being repealed, what's replacing it is license will mean an angling license issued in accordance with the regulations made pursuant to the Fisheries Act, and minister means the member of Executive Council. to whom for this time being the administration of the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act is assigned. There's amendments to the Wildlife Act by adding the definition of aquatic species at risk, which I've already mentioned, and by repealing the definition of wild species at risk and substituting for a new wild species at risk, which I believe I mentioned in my previous comments. Wild species at risk will now mean any native wild species that have been designated and listed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council pursuant to subsection 49(1) as extirpated, endangered, threatened, or vulnerable, but does not include any aquatic species at risk. And that is about it for that. This is a very brief bill, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I would like to move to adjourn debate of Bill number 184.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 184. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Adjourn debates, item number 11. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'm so excited to enter into debate on Bill number 187. I was ready and standing in my place waiting for you to call on me to enter into this debate. Of course, Bill number 187 is the Administration of Estates Amendment Act. This is a bill, I believe, that was initially introduced in 1998, which is getting to be on 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. So there is some reasonable need for update of this piece of legislation. In the opening or in the second reading remarks by the minister on November the 12th, the minister noted that these changes came in consultation with the public guardian and trustee, certainly an important office in our province, and one that I'm sure the minister would be wise to listen to concerns about, given that this is the business of that office every day. And of course, the administration of estates is something that is important when we get to the business of administering estates. Obviously and often that is a very wrought process, often very full of emotion as there is death associated with that. So very important to get this right and as much as possible make the process clear and smooth so that there might be a reasonable process set out to reduce and reduce acrimony in that process. So some of the things that are anticipated here, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Deputy Speaker, are adding the definition of capacity to the list of defined terms. So I'll just take a second to look at those definitions. The definition of capacity that is proposed here defines capacity as the ability to A, understand information relevant to making decisions with respect to property and financial affairs, and sub B, to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences of making or not making a decision mentioned in Clause A. So that is a fairly standard, I would think, definition of capacity. Having not a lot of experience in these matters, I did turn back to the member for Regina Northeast and asked about how these matters of capacity are adjudicated in the court system. And of course, there's a definition here of capacity, but there may reasonably be claims on either side of an estate in dispute about whether someone has capacity or not. So I'm told that there are other pieces of legislation, a list of those professionals in the community who might have, who would have the ability to make a ruling or not a ruling, make a determination of capacity or not. Not that isn't contained in this this proposed piece of legislation in front of us. Some of the other pieces changes the reference to official administrator to public guardian and trustee, just updating the term that we currently use in the province. Specifies that the public guardian and trustee may be granted letters of administration if no letters have been granted to another person as set out in Section 13, and specifies the reasons for removing an executor or administrator of a will. Certainly something that in an already difficult process I could imagine could reasonably be a difficult process, so it specifies under which conditions or reasons that might be done, and repeals part of the existing Act, Part 8, respecting the official administrator. So those are some of the housekeeping pieces, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know that this is one of a number of bills that will be falling to my colleague, the member for Regina Douglas Park, in her critic roles to continue to consult with members of the community and experts in the field to ensure that we have heard all potential and reasonably foreseeable consequences to this change. And I know that she is and will continue to diligently be going about doing that work. So I'm going to leave that in her capable hands, having gotten some of my thoughts about this, this bill on the record. And with that, we'll move to adjourn debate on Bill number 187.
The member from Regina Lakeview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 187. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourned debates, item number 12. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's again a pleasure to be able to add my remarks with regards to changes with this piece of legislation. I've previously had an opportunity to put a lot of remarks with regards to the changes to the bill that was discussed previously, Bill 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act, which I felt that a lot of those changes kind of aligned with the changes with regards to this piece of legislation, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act, because some of the language that was in one of what the other legislation kind of relates to the language in this, and I believe that is one of the reasons for these changes. So the move to the official administrator from the Administration of Estates Act to this Act seems to be one of the major changes with this piece of legislation, and update the term of official administrator and replace with public guardian and trustee. And we know the public guardian and trustee is the agency that deals a lot with administrating. They're the official administrators for Saskatchewan, so implementing a lot of the acts that need to happen with regards to changes to estates. Another piece of the change within this piece of legislation is that unclaimed assets can be transferred to the Crown after 6 years. And so I guess this is similar to legislation that's been implemented in Ontario and BC. So it'll be interesting to find out the reasons behind that change. I believe there's a lot of history with regards to that and some issues that have been a part of why they decided to make this change. And again, some of the changes are reflective to what the current practices are. So they were recommended by the guardian and trustee office, and they asked the government if they could make sure that those changes are implemented with the amendments to this bill so that it's reflective of what their current practices are. So with that, Mrs. Deputy Speaker, it is good to be able to look through these pieces of legislation, but I know that the critic responsible for with talking to committee and talking to stakeholders will do her due diligence and will assure that all of the stakeholders are consulted. And I think, again, like I said with the previous bill, that making sure that the public's aware of this changes is very important, because I don't know if it will impact any current estates or wills that are in place. So I think that'll be something that we need to discuss further. But with that, I adjourn debate on Bill number 188.
The member has moved to adjourn debate Bill 188. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 13. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 189, the Coroners Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Fairview.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 189, the Coroners Amendment Act of 2019. I note that the minister in his second reading speech talked about the fact that there was a review that took place that many of us remember by the Chief Coroner, Clive Wayhill, in October 2017. And that a final report was released in 2018 that made 44 recommendations, and these changes are being proposed as a result of what those recommendations are. This is what the minister has had to say about why these changes came about. We will certainly be reviewing the report to ensure that these changes are reflected accordingly. It looks like there are a number of different issues that are being changed in this legislation that cover a variety of areas. So the Chief Coroner's authority to appoint coroners instead of having the minister do that, allowing an inquest coroner to make recommendations at the conclusion of an inquest, allowing family members of a deceased to request a review by the chief coroner of a coroner's decision of a chief coroner not to hold an inquest, and allowing coroners to reopen investigations in certain cases where new evidence arises. I will note that not all of the recommendations are legislative in nature, so the minister notes that there's other areas that are being changed outside of the legislation as well. It appears as though, from the news, that the chief coroner is supportive of the legislation as it is written. So I note that in Global News on November 13th, which is pretty recently, the SAS chief coroner says that proposed changes would put the service on par with the country. So we've certainly heard an endorsement here, and the argument for taking away some of the powers from the minister and getting them out of politicians' hands seems sound. But our justice critic has also identified the importance of action and follow-up. So what is actually done with the recommendations that come out of the chief coroner's office, and the fact that those recommendations are only as strong as the government's will to bring those recommendations into force. So we do have some questions about how that follow-up is going to be taking place, and to make sure that there is a process for those follow-ups to happen, and that there's follow-through by the ministries that the recommendations are made to. We also have some questions about what measures will be put in place to address delays in toxicology analysis, and what the plan is to implement some of the coroner's recommendations around an inquest review committee, putting in place a formal child death review committee, adding a forensic toxicology laboratory, development of a mass casualty plan, increased training for community coroners, hiring an advocate for families going through an inquest, increasing cultural awareness with respect to the culture and rituals of Indigenous and New Canadians, and other recommendations, including the application of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Report. So we will be sure to look through this legislation with a fine-tooth comb, and I know that there will be other of my colleagues that will want to weigh in, and with that I would move to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member has moved to adjourn debate Bill 189. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 14. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deputy Speaker. I rise today to enter into the bill on number 190, the Expropriation Procedures Amendment Act. And of course, it's again a shining example of the imaginative agenda that the folks have before us as they correct their ways. We only have to think about the GTH and some of the fiascos that happened with the land appropriation around the GTH and the bypass. And so maybe these are some of the lessons learned. It seems relatively straightforward. The minister, when he was speaking about it, talked about when this bill was first passed, when interest rates were higher, and now with them being lower, that it would be reasonable to have the settlements maybe at a different rate than 6%. Yeah, so I feel that we'll have to take a look at this and find out about the unintended consequences, how this is thought through. You know, I mean, the government's always looking at ways to save money, and yet we have questions that have been raised about payments of that they take to court. And they're the ones who are fighting in court, where people, they say farmers may want to delay this, or landowners may want to delay this, and yet we see a government on that side who sides with Vinci in court trials, only extending this out. So I don't know if this is will have an impact on that or not. I don't think so, but at any rate, it's one that we have questions about, and we think that with a hand so would the word be bloodied in terms of the things that has happened over the GTH and the bypass, that I do have some questions about how this will go. So it talks about the Act providing mediation between parties through the Public and Private Rights Board, and hopefully they have had some say, of course, and this is a government that has drawn or really pushed more and more work towards the Court of Queen's Bench. And actually, it would be interesting to know how much more work the Court of Queen's Bench has actually had since the Sask Party has come into power, because more and more of the decisions are coming out of that. So with that, I know there'll be more thought and people will want to be talking more about this, but at this point I'm going to move adjournment on the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate Bill 190. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates, item number 15. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to briefly introduce and recognize the Minister of Health, and then I'd like to move along with my remarks to focus on Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. I won't get too far into the substance of this legislation here today. Certainly, it's critical that we get legislative changes as they relate to the regulation and legislation pertaining to corporations right. So I know our justice critic and our team will be consulting with stakeholders all across the province. I know the minister's remarks have suggested that these changes are responding to and conforming with changes that are happening nationally and in other parts of Canada. And that's often how laws are changed. And there's value in, at times, in consistency on these fronts, but certainly we want to make sure we understand the intention of and consequences of the changes that are brought forward. There's various changes that have been brought forward. One area that I think really needs a better focus when we're talking about corporate structures, though, and when we're talking about laws of Saskatchewan, is the skirting of the farmland security laws in Saskatchewan as it pertains to the illegal purchase of farmland by foreign entities, by foreign capital. Certainly this is a large concern in this province. For many in this province, many in rural Saskatchewan, many in our agricultural community. And we know that and are told that there's structures that are being organized by lawyers and financial structures that skirt the laws that we have in place, Mr. Speaker, and that that allow foreign capital, foreign interests to purchase farmland in Saskatchewan, not consistent with our law, Mr. Speaker. We know that the Sask Party government has really turned a blind eye to this important issue, hasn't been willing to dig in and investigate what's going on with respect to the illegal purchase of farmland by foreign entities. We know that this act relates directly to beneficial ownership and has some changes on that front. But we're told, I've been told, that beneficial ownership exists with foreign capital and on many in many purchases in this province that are not consistent with our law. And there's a reason that we have that law in place, and my view is we should enforce it. And we've suggested in the past that with the simple stating of all beneficial ownership related to the purchase of farmland would allow for transparency on this front and allow for the Farmland Security Board to do its good work and prevent the skirting of the law on this front. And certainly not in the interests of agricultural producers and landowners in Saskatchewan and, of course, across Canada, because any Canadian or Canadian corporation can own land in Saskatchewan. That's something that I think is reasonable, but the problem is our laws aren't able to be enforced, and we have many purchases, I'm told, skirting those laws. So we'll continue to push for effective measures to ensure the laws of Saskatchewan are in fact enforced, and to stop the foreign purchase of farmland, the illegal foreign purchase of farmland in Saskatchewan. With that being said, I will adjourn debate as it relates to Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019.
The member has moved to adjourn debate Bill 191. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourned debates, item number 16. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 192, the Legal Professions Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 192, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act of 2019. When we look at this act and what some of the changes are that are being suggested here, we see that the name, the Law Foundation, was changed into Law Foundation of Saskatchewan, which seems relatively straightforward in housekeeping. It adds a new definition of board to simplify references to the board of directors of the foundation through the act. makes housekeeping amendments to some sections, changes the composition of the board to 4 persons appointed by the minister and 5 appointed by the benchers, extends the term of a member of the board from 2 to 3 years, requires the board to elect a chairperson and vice chairperson from among its members rather than having the chairperson be appointed by the benchers. So there are definitely some important implications of this legislation. It largely revolves around board governance of the Law Foundation. So we will make sure that we're spending some time digging into it. I know the critic is going to dig into it to ensure that there are not any unintended consequences of the changes in board composition, for example, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The intents here seem relatively straightforward, and the explanations that have been provided in the explanatory notes, I would encourage any folks that are following along at home to have a look at the explanatory notes, because I find they do provide a lot of detail whenever we're looking at a bill that is being amended, in terms of which clauses are being amended and what the rationale is for each of those clauses. But we will be checking in with stakeholders and making sure that there are these changes to the board don't have negative consequences, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But with that, I would move to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 192, the Legal Professions Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourned debates, item number 17. Resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You know, in this job, almost every day, I learn something new. And it's an amazing job for that. We get exposed to new opportunities. We get tours of facilities. We learn about parts of the world around us and we get exposed to people around us that we never had the opportunity or the inclination to do before. And so that's an amazing part of this job. And so as I was looking at this particular bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm humbled a little bit to admit that I learned something new, and it was the meaning of the word artificial. Because as I looked through this bill, it's pretty mundane amendments, fixing, gender, words and meanings of definitions, and the only one that jumped out at me as at all possibly of any real consequence was the meaning of artificial, or changed to artificial in the Land Surveyors Act, and it turns out that that is also not particularly significant. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do want to mention, if I may, when I got elected here a year ago, and when I ran a year ago, I did that because, in my view, the status quo in our province isn't enough. It's not good enough. There are people in our province that are hurting. There are businesses in our province that are suffering. They're closing up. When you drive through rural Saskatchewan, our main streets in our hometowns have been hollowed out. There's buildings that are sitting there empty with for sale signs or for lease signs that have been there for long periods of time. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I see from the legislative agenda this particular session is it's just lacking. It's completely lacking. It just illustrates that this government is old and tired and out of ideas. Mr. Deputy Speaker, every day the legislative agenda that we are presented with in this sitting demonstrates that the government is satisfied with the status quo. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the status quo is not good enough. Every single day I'm looking for any evidence that this government has any ideas left to use this legislature to make the life of people in this province better. And every day we see the opposite. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if the Sask Party government doesn't have a plan to make lives better for Saskatchewan people as a government, well, we do. To begin with, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's a bill before this Assembly. Our proposal to have a suicide prevention strategy, that could make a real difference in saving people's lives. People who are hurting so much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that they would take their own life. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government could fix their broken record on education or health care. They could deal with the funding shortfalls that are seeing our classes crowded. They could deal with the hallway medicine that has become commonplace, the wait lists in our healthcare sector. They could take action on the renewable energy in this province that's a vital part of addressing our carbon footprint. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is sad to see a government that is so out of ideas that all we have in this legislative agenda is the Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act, the Statute Amendment Act. That's the main substance of the bills before us. This government is so out of ideas, it makes it clear that they don't think that they have to work to earn people's votes. No wonder people are ready for a change, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can assure you that we on this side of the House will work hard every single day. And with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
It has been moved that this House does now adjourn. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House is adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.